Marcus, we talked in part two about being an endangered species, but you've lived through a very good part of the career. What would be the highlight for you as a reporter, a story you've worked on?
Blimey, well, it's hard to really pinpoint one. I think we talk about sort of the exclusive story. I think that is always what you're aiming for. We're racing is obviously a competitive sport on the track, but within the press room, there's a little bit of competition as well. You're trying to get something that your rivals or your colleagues don't have. So, my memory isn't the greatest anymore. So thinking back a number of years, but last year I did a story about drones on racecourses, which was quite good. It's quite topical at the time and worked very well. So I got a chance to speak to Mahmoud Al-Zarouni about his situation. Obviously, he's the disgraced Godolphin trainer. He was hoping to try and ask the BHA to allow him to come back. So all those sort of things, are good to, that they're, if you see them in the paper, that's what you're doing your job for, really. That's what you're hoping to get.
Okay, now a lot of people may not know that you are president of the HWPA, which is the Horse Writers and Photographers Association. Can you just briefly describe what that organisation is and does?
Yeah, I think its actual origins go back to the 1930s, when I think a group of racing correspondents met in a sort of a pub, probably ironically, on Newmarket High Street. The Rutland Arms, I think that's where the meeting was recorded there. But then obviously I think it fell into abeyance, but then it was restarted in the late 60s by Sir Peter O'Sullivan and Clive Graham, who at the time were colleagues on the Daily Express and sort of, very well respected and very well known journalists. And it was, essentially it is a trade association, and it's developed along the line. Photographers were incorporated a few years ago, and we are there essentially to liaise with the racecourses and represent journalists and photographers in helping them in any dispute if anything arises, but just trying to sort of make sure the facilities that we have in press rooms and the access we have is which is a particular issue, that we have, I think, at the moment, that is maintained. There are a lot of demands on the protagonists in racing, be they trainers, jockeys, and owners, in terms of maybe the television channels we have now, especially at big meetings, and that sometimes erodes the time that the written press has access to these people. So issues like that, we're trying to make sure that that we are still being able to do our job properly on the racecourse.
Okay, now anyone that's been to a press room midweek, you quite often find that they're nigh often empty, or maybe one solitary person in there. Do you think that that it's now time that the doors are sort of flung open to encourage young independent sort of kids, or youngsters that do sort of blogs and online reports off their own back, that sort of thing?
I think that undoubtedly the dynamic has changed massively, and number one, first answer to your question is that I think it's a terrible situation that press rooms now are relatively deserted at certainly smaller meetings, and some of the bigger tracks at their quieter meetings, there is the number of people in press rooms has dropped considerably, which I think is bad for the sport. Because I think if the media aren't there just as observers and picking up things is very, is a bad thing. I think the Racecourse Association, who control media access, and the racecourses themselves, are going to have to look at the way forward. I think that the dynamic has changed. The old-fashioned, what I call old-fashioned, but it's probably not that many years ago, but the days when people were aligned to newspapers or organisations has changed. A lot more people now do multiple jobs. There are a lot more freelancers. As you say, there are a lot more diverse sort of jobs within the media, and I think that they're going to have to look at that, and we're going to have to look at the rules in the next few years. Obviously, you've got to certainly have rules. You can't dispense with rules completely, because you need to press rooms are one thing. The press rooms being deserted, but with a press badge becomes access to certain areas on the racecourse, like the paddock and the winners' enclosure. And the one thing you can't do is make that a complete free for all, because there are issues there, certainly safety issues primarily, that you have to have sort of restrictions there. So changes will come, I'm sure, but they've also got to be balanced.
Okay, they're changing the subject to betting. This bookmaking industry appears to be under a lot of pressure at the moment from a lot of different angles. Do you feel that the anti-gambling sentiment isn't necessarily one of the general public, but one driven by some areas of the media, the non-racing press?
I just don't, not necessarily just the media, I think, but I think that certainly, it's one thing that probably unites the wider media. Bookmakers are very easily portrayed as the bad guys, aren't they? And betting has become a subject a little bit sort of smoking in some ways, that it's something that is frowned upon, and it's easy. It's and even for government, I think, and for all politicians, it's quite an easy subject, because they can point to some very emotive stories, and they can make some statements and express views, and it's a very easy win for them, without necessarily examining the real hard facts. And emotive stories can get very big headlines.
And would you also agree or disagree that seems that racing itself, even in small ways, is trying to distance itself from betting a bit? Or would you disagree with that?
I don't know if it's trying to distance itself anymore. There's always been a sort of like a bit of an uneasy sort of relationship between racing and betting. I don't know if it's particularly. Maybe people are thinking a little bit more about it because of the headlines that racing has got. But I think that there are sort of wider issues within the bookmaker racing relationship that affect it more seriously, I think, really.
Okay, we've used the word emotive a few times, and it's very difficult to talk about this subject and not upset somebody or seem callous or heartless. But is the problem not the gambling industry itself, but the individual that has a problem with the gambling industry, the same as some people do with drink, drugs and food, or anything else that people get addicted to? So should the focus not lay on helping those individuals as opposed to trying to restrict the entire industry?
Yeah, well, I think that the problem with we're obviously dealing here with addictive personalities. That's what it comes down to, and those addictive personalities could be addictive to quite a number of things. Maybe it's just betting as being the focus on these particular stories. I do think that maybe one thing where the betting industry has to maybe work better with the media is to getting over its story a lot better, the facts and figures, and putting some of these stories into perspective, because at the moment I think the reality of the figures that are out there in terms of the number of problem gamblers that there is vastly outweighed by, that word again, emotive stories, because I'm afraid those stories are very easily relatable to readers. If they see a horror story about what's happened to a particular individual, and maybe evidence that behind there a bookmaker has not paid due attention or has not maybe has allowed somebody to fall into a bad situation, those outweigh hard facts and figures. And I think that is something that the betting industry probably has to convey, not just to the sports sections, to us who are involved in it, but more importantly probably to the people who are trying to who are writing the stories about them in the front of newspapers. And that, I don't pretend that's not a very hard thing to do, because basically those emotive stories get big headlines and they sell newspapers.
So we talked before about people losing their jobs, and even the trade daily doesn't send people to the every meeting anymore. Why do you think the public consumption of the written word about racing sort of appears to be on the wane, despite being hugely popular and a well-attended sport? And also, like looking at the Mail on Sunday this weekend, loads about football, loads about cricket. Why is it that people don't seem to want to read about racing, or is that just the way the editors feel?
Well, I think that there is definitely a personal influence from the editors you work under, and you know pretty soon if they like racing or they don't like racing in your personal dealings with them. I think that on a wider sort of subject on this, the sports journalism or sports coverage is really much more or increasingly about big events, and so it's polarizing. Now football is just a different planet. You know, football, anything that happens in football, it's just got its own rules. But outside football, be it cricket, rugby, or other sports, but cricket coverage is largely about Test match cricket, isn't it? It's not about county cricket, or there's not much county cricket in newspapers anymore. Rugby is about international rugby, and obviously you get big stories like the recent story about the Saracens was obviously the salary cap breach that's getting massive coverage. But I think racing then is similar in that it's big events, so the coverage has evolved. So there will still be massive coverage in the build-up to the Cheltenham Festival, and there will be massive coverage in the build-up to the Grand National and the Derby and Royal Ascot. But in between those big events, the coverage declines, and I think that partly is a way that the newspapers have evolved, and it's partly again going back to the economic situation. There isn't as much space, certainly in the hard copies of newspapers. Obviously, websites are a different thing, but websites have the Mail Online is a global website. We proudly boast that we're the biggest sort of newspaper website on the globe, and the metrics that are involved in there are easily, they can be monitored very easily, and racing on the Daily Mail website doesn't get as many hits as some other sports, and that's partly believe it or not, sort of some of the sort of martial arts, ultimate fighting get a lot more hits than racing, because that's a lot from the Far East, so that comes in, apparently. That's what I've been told. So it's not it's not all deliberate, but it is just an evolving situation, and racing has got to, I think, slightly accept that. And I think that if there's a lesson to be learned, it's that you've not got to be too worried about the in-betweens, but you've really got to pour even more into your big events to make them really punch their weight.
Okay, now talking about weight, this may have been an issue for the for this next story. That'd be rude. Now you've had experience from the other side of the fence as a jockey, riding at Windsor in a charity race where you raised £8,000. Now, tell us a little bit about that. And did you think afterwards maybe that was something you should have pursued as a youngster?
I think you used the word jockey very loosely there, Simon. No, it was just something it was ultimately, it started off as a challenge between a late night sort of over a few glasses of whatever, and myself and Amy Starkey, who runs Newmarket Racecourse, sort of said, let's try and riding one of these charity races. And the idea was the Newmarket Town Plate, but Amy sadly fell by the wayside. She had a fall that meant she couldn't do it, and then I had a fall as well, but I still ended up going for a different event. So no, it certainly, I didn't miss my vocation. That's certainly not true. But it was a great experience, and I concentrated on it for it took up sort of 9 months of my life, and it became it was something that you really had to focus on, because I'm not a natural by any means. But what the great thing was it gave me an insight into not an insight into how to be a jockey at all, but going into a stable virtually on a daily basis, which I had to do in the end, so I could get the riding experience. Just what the lads and the lasses and the grooms there have to do every day, and going in on a cold morning to riding horses that are unruly and are difficult, and it's a tough old life for them. My admiration grew for them. We don't drive to work thinking it's going to be a tough. I'm not looking forward to the first hour because some horse is going to try and kick me up the gallops. But some of them do, and I wouldn't fancy that for any money at all.
Okay, so by the sound of it, then you don't want to give up journalism to work in a stable. But where do your ambitions lie for the future? As a final question.
Blimey. Well, bearing in mind what we've been saying about the future of racing correspondence, probably survival is probably the biggest ambition. No, I love what I do really, I haven't got any sort of great ambitions in terms of want to do this, want to do that. I just love covering the sport day in, day out. I suppose if I have an ambition, it's to try and keep the racing coverage, certainly in the Mail, which is the only thing I can control, as good as it can be, because it's things are changing, and it does become harder, and sometimes it can be, you think you're sort of banging your head against a brick wall sometimes in terms of trying to get coverage, but I think there's a great product out there, and that I hope that racing can evolve a little bit more, and sort of, as I mentioned, the big events and just things that capture people's imagination. I think it's harder for racing than it is for any of the sports, but we look at things like the 100 in cricket, which is coming up this year. I think that's going to get massive coverage, and that's because it's got big names from all around the world who are going to come and play cricket in Britain in the summer, and I think that will be a massive focus. And another diversion on the sporting landscape. I think racing has to look at that, and while it's not easy to use that as a template and say we can use this, but big names, big events really sell. And in terms of what I'd like to see, before I retire, I'd love those big events to have the stage themselves a lot of the time. So when we have the Derby and we have Royal Ascot, maybe just a few less meetings, so that we're not having to carry cards from everywhere else, and the space in the newspapers is taken up, and we can tell the stories about the characters, because there are some great people in racing now. We all know about Frankie and people like that, but I think there are some really great youngsters coming along who are more media savvy, prepared to talk and open up and tell their stories. And I think that the opportunities are becoming certainly smaller in national newspapers, but we've got to try and maintain that space if we can.
Great stuff from Marcus Townend. Thank you very much.